Texas Hill Country. April 1878, the morning light spilled over the limestone ridges like spilled gold, and Naomi Archer knew before she stepped outside that the town would whisper again. She gripped the wooden porch rail of her father's boarding house, her fingers pale against the weathered grain. The air was thick with spring bluebonnets blanketing the hills, bees humming somewhere out near the barn, but her chest stayed tight. Her father's voice echoed in her memory, low and certain. "No man will want a girl like you, Naomi. You ask too many questions. You read too much. You walk like you're going somewhere." She was 22 now and had never been courted, not once, not even by the shy preacher's son who used to leave wildflowers in her Bible when she was 16. Folks said she was strange, too quiet, too clever, too plain. She had learned to endure the ache of loneliness with the same grit. She used to carry water from the well or scrub bed linens till her back ached. But that morning, everything changed. A rider came down the dusty road that split the town of Mason like a blade tall in the saddle, hat pulled low, horse moving at a steady, easy pace. Naomi was not looking for anything when she glanced up. She was only checking the sky for storm clouds. But her eyes caught on him like a hook in cloth. The cowboy slowed his horse as he neared the boarding house, and for a breath of time he looked straight at her. Not like the others looked, with judgment or idle curiosity. He looked like he saw her. Like he had been searching and just found what he had not known he was missing. Naomi's heart beat once hard. She stepped back inside before he could speak, before she could do something foolish. But by supper, he was at her table. "Even in, ma'am," he said as he tipped his hat politely. "Name's Merritt Nolan. Heard you had a room." Up close, he looked dust-worn and sun-browned, strong-jawed with kind eyes the color of wet cedar bark. His voice was steady, low, touched with something that made her skin feel too tight for her bones. "You want a room?" she asked, folding her apron. "There's one upstairs, but it's plain." "I like plain," he said, and his smile was soft like he meant it. He paid for a week in advance. She brought him stew and cornbread, and he thanked her like it mattered, like she mattered. That night, Naomi could not sleep. She watched the lamp shadows climb the walls and thought about the way he had looked at her. By the third day, she learned he was a ranch hand passing through, drove cattle north in the spring, and stayed south when the work dried up. He helped her carry firewood without asking, fixed the loose hinge on the back gate, said little but watched everything. On the 6th morning, trouble rode in. A hard-faced man with a long coat and a pistol on his hip barged into the boarding house. Naomi backed up, heart banging hard. He was not from town. "I am looking for Nolan," the man growled. "Merritt Nolan." Merritt stepped out from the back room, towel slung over his shoulder. He did not flinch. "Jace," he said, voice flat, "this is not your business. The hell it ain't. You left me and my boys with half the herd and no warning. We rode through Comanche country alone because of you." Naomi stepped between them, surprised by her own courage. "This is a quiet house. You want to fight, take it to the street." Jace looked her over like she was something to scrape off his boot. "You his woman." Naomi felt heat rise up her neck. "No, but Merritt said quiet and sure, she is under my protection." His words hit her like a gust of wind. She stared at him, startled. Jace spit in the dirt. "You owe me, Nolan." "Not anymore," Merritt said. "Get gone." Jace left, cursing, but Naomi stood frozen. "Why would you say that?" she asked once the door shut. "Because it's true," Merritt said softly, looking down at her. "You should not have to stand between men like that." She wanted to ask what he meant. Wanted to ask why it made her chest feel tight in a different way now, but she only nodded. That night they sat out back under the sycamore. The air was cool, full of crickets and the smell of baking earth. "Why are you really here?" Naomi asked. Merritt glanced at her. I got tired of being alone. She looked down at her hands. People say I will never marry. Then people are blind. He said it like it was the most obvious thing in the world. Naomi blinked. You do not even know me. I know enough. Like what? Merritt turned toward her, his voice low and steady. I know you are brave. I know you work harder than most men I have met. I know you feel things deep but do not speak them out loud. I know you are not afraid to stand between trouble and someone you care about, even if it scares you. Her throat closed up. You are just saying that. I do not lie, Naomi. He leaned closer, slow and respectful. I saw you on that porch and knew I was not going anywhere. I have never looked at a woman before and thought that, she is it. But I do. Naomi's breath caught. I do not know how to be what a husband is supposed to be, he said. But I know I would never hurt you. And I would spend the rest of my life proving you are worth more than anyone ever told you. She looked at him, really looked. At the quiet strength in his hands, the truth in his eyes. The way he had never once treated her like she was too much or too little. Something inside her cracked open. I was told I would never marry, she whispered. But right now, that does not feel true anymore. Merritt reached for her hand, slow and sure. She let him. And for the first time in her whole life, Naomi Archer did not feel alone. She felt claimed, chosen, seen, and she did not want him to go. The boarding house roof needed patching. Merritt noticed it first when a light rain crept through the parlor ceiling in a fine, steady drip. Naomi hadn't said anything, just moved the fiddle leaf fern to a dry corner and kept on mending a shirt cuff with her eyes fixed low. But Merritt saw the way her jaw set tighter than usual. The next morning, before she came down, he climbed to the roof with a hammer and a length of pine shingles he'd bartered for at the carpenter's shed behind the mill. By the time the sun stood high and hot, the leak was gone. He came down with a cracked knuckle and dust in his collar, and Naomi passed him a cup of well water without a word. Her hands brushed his as he drank. She didn't pull away. That evening, Naomi took him to the edge of her father's land. They walked in silence down a narrow path that cut through knee-high grass, where the scent of crushed mint clung to their boots. She wore a linen shawl over her shoulders and her hair was braided off her neck, damp from the heat. My mother's buried out here, she said, stopping beside a cedar post wrapped in rusted wire. She used to hum to the chickens when she fed them, no tune I've ever heard again. Merritt touched the brim of his hat. She raised a daughter with steel in her spine. She wanted me to marry a man who'd never raise his voice. That's what she prayed for when I was born. She looked out past the grave, where the hills rolled into blue haze. I stopped praying for things a long time ago. Merritt leaned against the post. I never much prayed either. But sometimes I think maybe there's a kind of mercy that isn't asked for, just finds you when you're too tired to go looking. Naomi didn't speak. She reached down to pull a weed from beside the grave, her fingers brushing the dry earth. Then she straightened. You have people, she asked. Had a brother, Merritt said, voice quiet. Died near Red River. Took a bullet meant for someone else. Her eyes met his, steady. That why you left the cattle crew, he nodded once. I got tired of watching men chase coin and call it honor. They walked back without speaking. The sun was dipping low and the cicadas had begun their long, rising cry. At the porch, Naomi paused. Most men don't fix roofs without asking why they should, she said. Most men don't meet women like you, Merritt replied. She didn't smile, but her eyes softened. That night, after the guests had gone quiet in their rooms and the lanterns were out, Naomi sat at the kitchen table with a sewing needle resting idle in her hand. Merritt came in barefoot, carrying a loaf of bread he'd traded for a coil of rope and a long-handled saw. He set it on the table like it was something sacred. I saw you running low, he said. Naomi traced the edge of the table with her fingertip. "You don't owe me bread." "I know." He didn't sit, just stood there watching her like he was listening for something inside her she hadn't spoken yet. She finally looked up. "I don't know what to do with someone who stays." "You don't have to know yet," Merritt said. "You just have to let me." She stood then, slow and uncertain, and stepped closer. "I never thought a man would look at me and not see what I lack." Merritt's voice was low. "I see what's there, not what isn't." She reached out, touched the frayed edge of his sleeve. "And if I can't give you a simple life, if I ask too much," he took her hand, firm and warm, "then we'll make one that fits us. Not them." Naomi closed her eyes and for the first time in years let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, she was worth building a life around. Outside, the wind stirred the mesquite, and the stars burned steady in the dark. The first Sunday after Merritt arrived, Naomi walked to the church alone. She hadn't asked if he'd come. He hadn't offered. Some things, she figured, needed time to unfold without pressing. The bell rang once, low and steady, and she stepped into the white clapboard chapel, nodding to Mrs. Elwell and the butcher's wife without waiting for their returned glances. The pews were worn smooth by years of restless hands and heavy hearts. Naomi sat in the third row, where the morning sun cut through the high windows and lit the dust as it floated down like ash. She folded her hands and kept her eyes forward. When the hymn ended and the prayer began, a shadow moved beside her. Merritt didn't say a word, just sat, hat in hand, shoulder close enough she could feel the warmth of him through her sleeve. They didn't look at each other. They didn't need to. After the service, outside among the gravel and wagon ruts, she glanced up at him. His hair was still damp from where he'd scrubbed it clean. His boots had been polished, not perfectly, but with care. "You didn't have to come," she murmured. "I know," he said. "Didn't feel right not to." They walked back in silence, past the mercantile and the feed store, through the narrow trail behind the schoolhouse. The heat was climbing again, the kind that settled behind the knees and under the arms. A pair of mourning doves took flight from a fence post as they passed. At the boarding house, Naomi paused before the stairs. "I need to ride out tomorrow," she said. "The well at the far pasture's gone low. I've got to check the spring-fed one beyond the cottonwoods. Then I'll come too." She studied him. "You ever ride double on a mule with a woman who doesn't like to be slowed down?" "I've done worse," he said, and the corner of his mouth lifted just enough to make her stomach flutter. She didn't answer with words, just nodded once and turned away before he saw her smile. The next morning, the mule brayed like it had something to say about the weight of them both. But Naomi only clucked her tongue and adjusted the canteen over her shoulder. Merritt sat behind her, arms loose around her waist, not holding tight but not distant either. They rode through dry mesquite and over limestone flats until the trees thickened and the air cooled. They didn't speak until the spring came into view. A shallow pool fed by a trickle from the rock face above, half shaded by cottonwoods. Naomi dismounted first. "Water's down but not dry," she said, crouching at the edge. "Might last another 2 months if we don't get a hard drought." Merritt knelt beside her. "You always come out here alone." "No one else knows the land like I do," she said. "And no one cares to." He reached into the water, pulled out a handful and let it fall back through his fingers. "You ever think about leaving?" She looked at him, startled. "Leaving? This town, this house, starting somewhere fresh." She straightened, brushing dust from her skirt. "I wouldn't know where to go. You wouldn't have to go alone." Naomi's throat tightened. "You'd walk away from what you know." "I've done it before," he said. "Difference is, this time I'd be walking toward something." She looked out at the trees, the way the light filtered through the leaves and dappled the water. "I've spent most of my life being told I'd never belong to anyone." "You don't belong to anyone," Merritt said gently, But you could belong with someone. That's different. Her voice was quiet. And you'd want that life. With a woman who doesn't bake pies or go soft when spoken to sweet, he stood. I want a woman who knows how to keep a place standing when the wind shifts, who sees what's broken and doesn't wait for someone else to fix it. I want you. The words settled between them like stones in deep water. Naomi rose and walked to the mule, tightening the saddle strap by feel. If I said yes, what then? We'd figure it out, he said behind her. One day at a time, she turned. You'd stay? Merritt nodded once. Long as I'm wanted. She stepped closer, fingers curling around the strap of his canteen. Then I guess we'd best start figuring. He reached for her hand, and this time she didn't pull away. The mule shifted behind them, tail flicking, unconcerned. The cottonwoods rustled overhead, their leaves whispering secrets to the wind neither of them needed to hear. Naomi looked up at him, steady and sure. You're not what I expected, she said. Merritt smiled, slow and quiet. Neither are you. And when their hands came together, it wasn't lightning or fire, it was something steadier, like ground after a long ride, like the first clean breath after a dust storm, something built to last. By early May, the mesquite pods had begun to drop, and Naomi found herself rising before first light, not from necessity but restlessness. She stood at the kitchen basin, sleeves rolled to the elbow, watching the sky change through the open window. The boarding house was quiet. Most of the ranch hands had moved on northward, and the last lodger had left 2 days earlier when his sister took ill in San Saba. The quiet felt different now. Not empty, just waiting. Merritt's saddle had stayed untouched on its hook in the barn for over a week. He came in from gathering kindling with a cut above his wrist, thin as a wire. Naomi rinsed a rag and reached for his arm without asking. You catch this on cedar? She asked, dabbing gently. Fence post wire, he said. Corner split and snagged me. You'll need to mend it before the goats find it. He didn't answer right away. I was thinking we could build a new corner brace, something that holds better through the rain. Naomi pressed the cloth against his wrist and looked up. If you're willing, he said. She tied a strip of muslin around the wound, snug but not tight. You'd want to stay through summer, I'd want to stay for good. She let go of his arm and stepped back. You mean that? I wouldn't have said it if I didn't. Naomi turned toward the hearth. The kettle was starting to hiss. I never pictured anyone tying themselves to this place for more than a season. Merritt leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. I don't think I'm tying myself to a place. She didn't ask what he meant. She knew. Later that week, they rode into town together. Not side by side, exactly. Naomi rode a half-length ahead, guiding her mule with a slack rein while Merritt kept pace beside her on a borrowed gelding. The townspeople watched but didn't speak. The blacksmith nodded once. Old Mrs. Talbot, who had once called Naomi peculiar to her face, turned away from the dry goods display without a word. Inside the mercantile, Naomi sorted through bolts of coarse cotton while Merritt scanned the tools hung along the back wall. You ever think about building something from scratch? He asked quietly. Naomi didn't look up. Like what? Cabin? Maybe a lean-to to start. Somewhere with a proper chimney, enough space for a table and a porch swing. She ran her fingers over the edge of a calico print. That'd take time. Materials. I've got enough saved to start, and I know how to barter for the rest. Naomi met his gaze. What would we do for income? He picked up a tin of nails, weighing it in his palm. You could keep hens, sell eggs, maybe take in mending. I could take seasonal work when needed. Or run a few head of cattle if we fence in enough. She didn't speak for a moment. Then, you think we'd be left alone? I don't care if we are, he said, but I'd keep you safe if we're not. They left the mercantile with a bag of flour, 5 yards of unbleached muslin, and a small tin of salve. Naomi didn't ask why he added the salve. She knew he watched her hands how raw they got when she scrubbed linens too long. That night, she rubbed it into her palms before bed. They stung, but not in a way that hurt. 2 days later, Merritt knocked once on the back door and stepped inside holding a folded piece of paper. Naomi looked up from the kitchen table. "What's that?" "Deed transfer," he said. "There's a patch of land just past the eastern ridge. Man who owned it died this spring. No kin." "I spoke to the county clerk yesterday." She stood slowly. "You're saying it's ours. I'm saying it could be, if you want it." She took the paper from him and unfolded it. The lines were spare, the signatures faint, but it was real. "I don't know how to build a home from nothing," she said. "I do," he replied, "and you know how to make it one." Naomi looked at him, her voice low. "If we do this, it's not a trial. I don't want a man who's halfway in." "I wouldn't ask you to take a half-meant promise," Merritt said, stepping closer. "I want to build a life with you. Not just a place to sleep." Her breath caught. "And if I say yes, then we start clearing the land tomorrow." She folded the deed carefully and set it aside. "I'll need to close the boarding house, settle the accounts. I'll help. No, this part's mine to finish." He nodded once. "Then I'll wait." "No," she said again, but softer this time. "You'll come with me to the ridge. We'll look at it together." He held out his hand. She took it. They rode out late that afternoon, past the edge of town, through the tall grass and over the last rise. The land stretched wide and quiet, dotted with oak and stone, a shallow creek winding through the far edge. Naomi dismounted and stood still, wind tugging at her braid. "I never thought I'd stand on ground that could be mine," she said. "It already is," Merritt said. "You just hadn't put your boots on it yet." She turned to him. "You sure you're ready for this?" "I've never been more sure of anything." She reached for his hand again, not because she needed to, but because she wanted to. And as the sun dipped low and the wind settled, Naomi Archer stood beside the man who had seen her from the start, not for what she lacked, but for what she was. Not someone to fix or carry or mold. Just someone worth choosing, and she had chosen him right back. They built the cabin in pieces. The first wall went up in mid-June, when the heat pressed down like a damp wool blanket and the dirt turned to fine powder beneath their boots. Naomi hauled lumber without complaint, and Merritt worked the frame with a hand plane he'd sharpened himself. A pair of barn swallows nested in the rafters before the roof was even done. They slept in the boarding house still, but each evening they rode out to the ridge to work until the light failed. Naomi brought biscuits wrapped in cloth, and Merritt brought flint and dry moss for the fire. They'd eat beneath the bare beams, backs against the half-built wall, the air heavy with cedar and sweat. One night, as a thunderhead rolled low across the western sky, Naomi leaned into his side and said, "I never thought I'd know what building something with someone felt like." Merritt didn't shift or speak. He just reached over and laced their fingers together like they'd always been meant to fit that way. By August, the walls stood straight and the door swung true on its leather hinges. Naomi carved their initials into the underside of the windowsill with the tip of Merritt's pocket knife. The blade dulled from months of work, but still sharp enough for that. "You think we'll be happy here?" she asked, brushing the shavings away. Merritt looked around the room, the wood stove set into stone, the shelf he'd built for her sewing things, the corner where he'd roughed out a cradle frame, though they hadn't spoken of it aloud. "I think happiness lives where you choose to stay," he said. They married in early September under a sky so blue it looked painted. No church, no preacher, just Naomi in a dress she'd sewn from the muslin they hadn't used for curtains, and Merritt in his cleanest shirt, collar stiff from starch. The blacksmith stood witness, and Naomi's old neighbor, Mrs. Hallie, brought a blackberry pie and wiped at her eyes when they exchanged vows. Naomi's voice didn't shake. Merritt's hands didn't tremble. Afterward, they walked the long way home, past the creek and the edge of the woods, shadows stretching behind them. Naomi stopped near the stump of a felled oak, the one they'd cleared for the outhouse. "I used to think love was for people softer than me," she said. Merritt stepped behind her, resting his hands at her waist. "There's nothing soft about what we've built." She turned to face him. "You're not afraid I'll get too hard over time?" He shook his head. "You bend. You don't break." That night they laid a blanket on the cabin floor and made a bed of it. Naomi pressed her cheek to Merritt's shoulder as the crickets sang outside, and for the first time, she believed the quiet around her wasn't something to be endured, it was something they'd earned. That winter, they sealed the windows with beeswax and old flour sacks. Merritt trapped rabbits when the snow came early, and Naomi learned to stretch their meals with dried beans and wild onions. The nights were long, but they were not lonely. In spring, the cradle stood finished in the corner, painted sky blue with leftover pigment Merritt had traded for a broken axe head. Naomi ran her fingers along the edge each morning, not because she doubted it was real, but because it was. One morning, Merritt returned from the barn with straw in his hair and a grin she hadn't seen before. "2 kids born this morning," he said, brushing off his sleeves. Naomi arched an eyebrow. "4 legs or 2, 4, he said, "but I figure we're not far off from the other." She didn't answer. Just reached for his hand and laid it against her belly, where the swell had begun to round beneath her apron. They named their daughter Wren, after the birds that still nested in the eaves. She came in the second spring, with the dogwoods blooming and the creek running high. Naomi brought her into the world with Merritt's hand at her back and her breath steady as stone. The midwife said little, but when it was done, she looked at Naomi with something like awe. "She's strong," she murmured. "Like her mother." Wren grew fast, with her father's quiet gaze and her mother's stubborn chin. She took her first steps between the hearth and Merritt's boot, and her first word was stick, which Merritt claimed was because she saw him carving one each morning for the fire. By the 3rd year, they'd added a henhouse, a second room, and a garden that stretched wide with corn and squash. Naomi taught Wren to braid garlic and snap beans, and Merritt built her a stool so she could reach the wash basin. They never left the hill, not once. Letters came from town sometimes, invitations and news, but Naomi never missed the world beyond their land. She had everything she'd once thought she'd never deserve. One warm evening, Merritt sat whittling on the porch while Wren chased a moth near the fence. Naomi stood in the doorway, a dish towel in her hands. "You ever regret not taking the northern trail?" she asked. Merritt looked up. "I took the one that led here." She stepped onto the porch beside him. "You think we'll grow old here?" he nodded. "We already are." Naomi laughed, and the sound startled Wren, who ran to her mother and wrapped both arms tight around her legs. Merritt set down his carving. "We should finish the swing before fall." Naomi looked toward the old oak near the edge of their patch. "You think it'll hold? It's held this long," he said, meeting her eyes. And that was enough. The wind shifted, warm and full of honeysuckle, and the sun slipped low behind the ridge, casting their little home in gold. Inside, the fire crackled. The floorboards creaked. The cradle in the corner waited for a second child they hadn't spoken of yet, but both knew was coming. Merritt reached for Naomi's hand, the same way he always had, slow, sure, with reverence. They stood like that as the evening fell. Woman, man, child, rooted in the land they'd claimed, wrapped in the life they'd built, and steadied by a love that had never needed to be explained to be understood.